Sheni and then go on to a different subject. That is, the Chidushei Harim, who's the first Ger Rebbe, the founder of the Chassidus of Ger, makes an extremely important point about Pesach Sheni, that the Torah says Pesach Sheni is an opportunity for those who are either Tameh or Derech Rechoka, far away. Now in the Midbar there was no concept of Derech Rechoka, you were there. But in Eretz Yisrael you could be far away. Now it's interesting, far away is an interesting definition of what is far away. Essentially it meant anybody who at the crack of dawn, Erev Pesach, could not reach Yerushalayim by Chatzos, because the Korban Pesach is only kosher from Chatzos. So if you couldn't reach Yerushalayim, does that mean by foot or even by by car or by a plane, whatever it would be? Which means, if you think about it, most of Eretz Yisrael were Rachaik, had a patur of Derech Rechoka, because basically you had to be within a 6-hour walk of Jerusalem. If you were within a 6-hour walk to Jerusalem, you would have to bring a Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan. If you were more than 6 hours away from Yerushalayim, you could, if you want, be Nidche de Pesach Sheni. Now, in some ways, that almost doesn't make any sense, because if you're 6 hours away the first time, you'll be 6 hours away the second time. I mean, what exactly is the Maila? I mean, if the issue would be you're traveling, that's one thing. But if I live in Bnei Brak, so you're telling me I'm Derech Rechoka, therefore I can bring it a month later. Well, a month later I'll have the same problem. So the Minchas Chinuch basically says, Avada, it's a davar pashut, that this is only b'diavad. L'chatchila, if you live in Eretz Yisrael, you're supposed to come. If you didn't come, then Hashem gave you a make-up opportunity. But it's not like a heter. It's not saying if you're 6 hours away. By the way, I'm saying 6 hours because that is the distance, meaning from the crack of dawn until Chatzos, 6 hours. But it may not be measured by walking. It might be measured by traveling. So Bnei Brak today would not be 6 hours away, because you could get from Bnei Brak to Yerushalayim in around an hour if you're using a car. So that's a separate shaila of what Derech Rechoka is. So Derech Rechoka is a bit complicated. But now let me share with you So the Chidushei Harim says there are two important lessons about Pesach Sheni. Lesson number one is, no matter how impure you think you are, no matter how far away from Hashem you think you are, that's Derech Rechoka, Hashem will give you a second chance. So metaphorically, Pesach Sheni is the gift of a second chance in life, that Hashem never writes you off. Sometimes I feel I'm so tameh, there's no way I could ever get close to Hashem again. Or sometimes it's like a fork in the road. I made the wrong choice. I took the wrong fork in the road, and then it gets wider and wider and wider and wider, right? Initially, there's a fork in the road, the good road, the bad road. They're only an inch apart. But I keep on going on the bad road, so I'm further and further and further and further away. So a person thinks there's no hope. But what do they say? Different scientists in cosmology talk about, they call wormholes. Like, the universe is so vast, but there are these shortcuts in which you can traverse trillions of miles, like through a certain hole. So tshuva is that way as well. Even if the fork in the road, you kind of feel you're billions of miles apart, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you can rejoin him. So Pesach Sheni is a very powerful metaphor for the idea that there's no tumah and there's no derech rechoka that prevents a person from his karvos to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's a great thing to know, that a person has to know that there's always this potential to be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the Chidushei Harim says there's a second condition. Because let's look at the way Pesach Sheni is structured. People were tameh, and they came to Moshe and they asked him, why should we be deprived of a chance? And Moshe didn't know the halacha, So we had to ask Hashem. So first of all, let me just raise a question. I had discussed this before, but just a quick review would be good. If we believe that Moshe was given all of the mitzvahs at Har Sinai, then presumably he was told at Har Sinai that people who are Tameh can bring a Pesach a month later. That's one of the 613 mitzvahs. So how could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know what the halacha was? We say Moshe was given the whole Torah at Har Sinai. So I've mentioned before the very interesting hesber of the Chazon Ish, that Moshe was given all the mitzvahs at Har Sinai, but he was not authorized to reveal them to Bnei Yisrael until certain things happen. That's why if you look at the whole Torah, you always see in the Torah that mitzvahs are given to the Jewish people after this happened, after this happened, after this happened. That's throughout the Torah. Meaning it was a 40-year process. We got mitzvahs over a 40-year period. There were many mitzvahs we did not get, we did not hear, until the day of Moshe Rabbeinu's death. So how do you reconcile that with the idea that everything was given at Sinai? The Chazon Ish says, everything was given to Moshe at Sinai, and Hashem decided when was Moshe authorized to reveal it to Bnei Yisrael. That's the meaning of the phrase, V'yedaber Hashem el Moshe le'mor. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, meaning what is that? The green light, le'mor. It is now you now have my rishus, Hashem says, to say it to Bnei Yisrael. Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. So Memela, here's the concept. Moshe Rabbeinu knew of the law of Pesach Sheni, but he was not yet given permission to reveal it to Bnei Yisrael. So he has to ask Hashem, do I have permission to teach them this law? And Hashem said yes. But what would have been if the people who were Tameh wouldn't have bothered to ask? Because they could have taken the position, hey, we're Patur, we don't have to bring a Korban Pesach. We're Patur, we don't have to bring it at all. Why make a fuss? If you're Patur from a mitzvah, you're Patur. If they wouldn't have asked, then at least for them, there wouldn't have been a Pesach Sheni. Now, maybe at some later point, Hashem would have decided to reveal it, because after all, he gave it to Moshe at Sinai. But it wouldn't have been revealed for them. Which means Pesach Sheni was revealed at that particular time and place only because people cared enough about Avodas Hashem that they were willing to ask and even argue. So says the Chidushei Arim, this is the second lesson of Pesach Sheni. The second lesson of Pesach Sheni is, Hashem will always give you a chance, no matter how far you think you are. But you have to want it enough to ask for it. If you don't care enough to really ask for it, then Hashem is not going to give it to you. This is what Chazal say. The way you want, the place you want to go is the place that Hashem will take you. Hashem is like a cab driver. You get into the cab driver asks you, where do you want to go? Wherever you want to go, that is where you will be taken. And that is the way Ruchnius works. If you want it, you will get it. If you don't want it, then it may not be there for you. In other words, Hashem is not going to drop it in your lap. Sometimes it happens. The Hanhagas can sometimes change, but B'derech Klal, it is a function of your ratzain, your desire. Okay, and those are the two lessons of Pesach Sheni. On one hand, we have the gift of the second chance, and on the other hand, we have the idea that you have to want it. If you wouldn't have wanted it, they wouldn't have gotten it. They would not have had a Pesach Sheni. They wouldn't have known what they're missing. They just wouldn't have had it. It wouldn't have been there because they didn't care enough to ask. Right? So those are the two lessons of Pesach Sheni. So now I want to share with you, just as an aside, a very interesting ha'ara from the Vilna Gaon. That is, the Gemara in Pesachim has a story that there used to be a goy who every Pesach would pretend to be Jewish. He would join up with a chabura, with a group that brought the Korban Pesach, and he would eat meat. So he was once speaking to Rav Yehuda ben Basera in Bavel, and he said, every year I participate in the Korban Pesach. Now Rav Yehuda ben Basera said, oh, wow, did they give you the meat of the tail, the sheep's tail? Now again, you have to know, the sheep's tail is fatty, and that is actually sacrificed on the Mizbeach. Nobody eats that, but the guy didn't know. So he said to the guy, they don't really care about you that much. Did they ever give you the tail? He said, no. He says, next time you're there, ask him for the tail. So he joins up the Chabura. Next year he shows up, and he says, I want to eat the tail. The tail? The tail is sacrificed on the Mizbeach. Who told you to ask for the tail? He says, the great Rabbi, Yehuda ben Basera. So they realized that was Rav Yehuda ben Basera kind of sending him a message that this guy is a guy, he doesn't belong here. And it's actually brought down that they killed him. Interesting question. Why did they kill him? What's the Chiyuv Misa? Now it's true. There is an Isser D'Oraisa for a guy who didn't convert to eat the Korban Pesach. Now it's interesting. Who is the Isser on? Is it shaykh to have an Isser D'Oraisa on a guy? A guy is not bound by the Torah. So some say the Isser D'Oraisa is on a Jew to give a guy a Korban Pesach. You can't possibly talk about it as an Isser D'Oraisa on a guy. A guy is not bound by the Torah. But others say that once the Torah says a guy cannot eat a Korban Pesach, for a guy to eat a Korban Pesach would be gezel, would be theft, which is one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and for that a guy is chayav misa. A guy can be killed for theft. Now, this gets us into a whole other question. Well, okay, a guy can be killed for theft, but doesn't the guy have to be sentenced either by a Beis Din or by a court? I mean, can there be vigilantism under the Noachite Code? Yeah, that's a very, very interesting, difficult question, because if you're going to start taking the position that there can be private enforcement of the death penalties of Dinei B'nai Noach, that would lead to some very, very surprising conclusions that I can go across the street and start shooting people up because a lot of them are murderers or whatever it would be. I'm not going to address that right now. The last rabbi that addressed it was in jail for a while, so I won't I won't go into that difficult question. But some do learn that there is such a thing as private enforcement of Dinei B'nai Noach, and if you assume that a guy eating the Korban Pesach is a Maisa of Gezel, that would justify the Chiyuv Misa. Okay, so that's a story in the Gemara about Rav Yehuda ben Basera telling the guy to ask for the Aliyah. Yeah.
Never mind.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
Never mind.
Oh, okay. Alrighty. So now, Tosfos asks the following kasha. What is Rav Yehuda ben Basera doing in Bavel? Why doesn't he come to bring the Korban Pesach? Now, you could answer that obviously he was Derech Rechoka, but once again, Derech Rechoka doesn't make a lot of sense when you're talking about a person who permanently lives far away, because Pesach Sheni doesn't really help him, so you might as well do it on time. So why didn't he come to bring the Korban Pesach? So Tosfos gives a very surprising answer. Tosfos says, Rav Yehuda ben Basera did not own any land in Eretz Yisrael. And Tosfos is mechadesh, a new exemption. A tamei is exempt, cannot bring the Korban Pesach. Derech Rechoka is exempt. But now there's a new exemption. One who does not own land in Eretz Yisrael is totally exempt. In fact, he doesn't even have to bring it Pesach Sheni. In other words, if you don't have land in Eretz Yisrael, you are exempt from the Korban Pesach. Now, to understand this, you have to understand that the Gemara does mention that a person who doesn't own land is exempt from certain korbanos, but it never says it by Korban Pesach. It says it by Olas Re'iyah, for the 3 pilgrimage festivals, right? All males are supposed to come to Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash, and they are supposed to bring a Korban Ola, and they have 7 days to bring it. They can bring it the first day of Yom Tov until the last day of Yom Tov. except on Shabbos, right? We talked about that, I think, last week. So the Gemara Taka says, Mi she'ein loy karka, pator min hare'iyah. That's the ola re'iyah when you're seen in the Azara. Tosfos is mechadesh that kishem, that mi she'ein loy karka, pator min hare'iyah, which is in the Gemara, mi she'ein lo karka is pator from Korban Pesach. That's even Pesach Sheni because you don't have karka. Yeah.
So let's say we start bringing the Korban Pesach next year. Does that mean like almost everyone in Israel would be exempt because technically Israel?
So that's what I'm going to address right now. Now, the Vilna Gaon asks a kasha on this Tosos. It is brought down that every single Jew, at least if they're not from converts, but every single Jew who's not from Gerus, definitionally owns, maybe you don't know where, at least 4 amos of land in Eretz Yisrael. Meaning, if you don't come from Gerus, now maybe most Jews do in some level, but if theoretically, if you had an unbroken descent from the time of Yoshua, then you would be an heir. There would be some piece of land in Eretz Yisrael that you own. Dalid amos. In fact, we even use this the halacha, because the halacha is that when you write a prusbul, right? Remember what a prusbul is? That if somebody owes me money, and Shemitah will cancel the loan, but if I give the loan over to a court, to a beis din, and they can make me an agent for collection, that's called a prusbul. That keeps the loan alive, and that allows me to collect it after Shemitah. You have to make a prusbul before the end of Shemitah. So Erev Rosh Hashanah, of this coming Erev Rosh Hashanah, you're going to make a prusbul, a declaration, along with a Taras Nadarim, and the appropriate forms will be available at the time. Now the Gemara says in Maseches Gittin that the only loans for which you can make a prusbul are loans in which the borrower has some real estate. So you can have a lien on his real estate. If the borrower has no real estate, you cannot make a prusbul. But we say in the prusbul that I'm making the prusbul based on the 4 amos of land in Eretz Yisrael that the borrower owns. Right? So we actually use this halachically. It justifies a prusbul. So Frekta Vilna Gaon, how can Tosfos say Rav Yehuda ben Beseira didn't have land? L'chaira, he had the 4 amos of land in Eretz Yisrael, which should have been mechayev him in Korban Pesach. Right? This is Tosfos' kasha. This is the Vilna Gaon's kasha. Yeah.
Leviim and Kohanim isn't it true they did not own land?
Yeah. So the truth of the matter, that's a good point. But Tosfos himself says that even though they didn't have a tribal division, but the Leviim did have 48 cities that were dispersed throughout Eretz Yisrael, and their ownership of Arei Leviim was enough to allow them to bring the Korban Pesach, because they did have 48 Levite cities. So here's what the Vilna Gaon says. Do you remember, some of you might remember if you learn Nach, a very, very famous, beautiful, powerful scene in the book of Yecheskel, where Yecheskel is prophesying. This is after the Churban Beis Hamikdash, over a valley of bones. Just bones. And he prophesies, and Hashem shows him this valley of bones, and the bones start coming together, getting flesh, that the dried bones become people and they become alive. And Hashem is saying, you think the Jewish people, after the destruction of the temple, after the exile, are just corpses, just bones. But those bones will live, and those bones will be revived. And that's a beautiful, beautiful symbol of the rejuvenation of the Jewish people. Right? This is called the prophecy, the nevuah of the Atzamos Hayaveshos. It actually is the Haftorah of Shabbos Chol HaMoed Pesach. We read this Haftorah. Now, what's going on? So, according to some opinions, this was a prophetic dream, meaning Yecheskel was not actually dealing with actual bones that got alive. Hashem was showing him a dream about the rejuvenation of the Jewish people. It was not a literal event. So the Gemara has an interesting discussion whether this was a real thing or this was a dream. So if it was a dream, it was a dream. If it was a real thing, the question is, what happened to these people? I mean, if Yecheskel had a vision of a valley of people who got revived, like what happened to them? And who were they? So according to one opinion, these were the corpses or the bones of the tribe of Ephraim, part of the tribe of Ephraim. Do you know this? 30 years before Moshe Rabbeinu, 30 years before the Exodus. They left Mitzrayim on their own initiative. They said, it's time. And what happened was they got decimated. They got killed. They got killed. So Yecheskel has a vision, and it's a reality, that these Atzamas Yeveshas of Bnei Ephraim, who left 30 years early, they too shall be revived and join the Jewish people. Okay. Assuming now that this was literal, and the Bnei Ephraim were revived, what happened to them? So according to one opinion, they died right away, meaning Yecheskel saw that they were revived, and then they dropped dead. It was just to show them. According to another opinion, they actually came to Eretz Yisrael. In fact, Yehuda ben Baseira got up and said, of course they remained alive. Of course they came to Eretz Yisrael. Because I am a descendant of them, and the tefillin that I'm wearing, I got from my great-great-great-grandfather. So, according to this, Rav Yehuda ben Baseira was a descendant of the Mesim Shehichya Yecheskel, who were the Bnei Ephraim who left Mitzrayim 30 years early. Now, when Eretz Yisrael was divided among the populations, it was divided based on those who left Mitzrayim, meaning every person who left Mitzrayim was assigned a share in the land that they then bequeathed to their descendants. But those people of Bnei Ephraim who left 30 years early, they were not part of the generation of the Exodus. They were pre-Exodus. There was no assigned portion that they had. If they came to Eretz Yisrael, they would have to rent, meaning they were renters, like anyone else. They can come and they could rent, but they didn't own any land in Eretz Yisrael because they were not the generation that left Mitzrayim with Moshe Rabbeinu. So Memela, the Vilna Gaon says, very beautiful, Rav Yehuda ben Baseira Bedafka did not own any land in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he was patur from the Korban Pesach, because he was a descendant of the Mesim Shehichya Yecheskel, which are the Chelek of Shevet Ephraim that left early. This is a real ingenious word. The only thing is, it seems to me that according to this, Tosafos's point is almost meaningless. Tosafos says, if you don't have land, you're patur from Korban Pesach. But every Jew has land. It's only what? If you're descendant from Bnei Ephraim, you don't have land. So the only nafkamina would be ger, meaning if you're a descendant of gerim, it could even if you're not a ger yourself, even if you're a descendant of gerim, then einachinami, it might be that you're patur from a korban pesach because there's no ownership of land that you could trace. So back to your question, would that mean that most of us would be patur from korban pesach? That might be a possibility. Would depend on a much more intense investigation of our lineage and the like. We talked about this a little bit when someone was asking a Q&A. I didn't give a definitive answer. I don't have a definitive answer. How do you explain the light-skinned features of Jews if that was not the indigenous Middle Eastern population profile? And one of the suggestions was there was such an infusion of Gerim or even non-Jews in the Jewish blood that the features changed and were modified that way. So the question would be, what does that suggest regarding our lineage and the like? And that would be a very difficult question that maybe genetic testing could help or the like. So it is a complicated problem, yeah.
So these Ephraimites that left Mitzrayim before the rest of
Yeah.
Israel, since they never experienced Har Sinai, they would not be Jews, right?
Well, they would be Jews because, after all, they did experience Yetzias Mitzrayim and the Korban Pesach, and they're descended with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The question would be, were their souls at Matan Torah? That would be the interesting question. Because remember, we do say that all the future souls of the Jewish people were at Matan Torah. What about the Jews who died before the Exodus? Now, keep in mind, this would not only be Shevet Ephraim. Shevet Ephraim left 30 years before. But what about the 4/5 of the Jews who died in the plague of darkness? What's going to happen to them? That I don't know. I'm not even aware of any prophecy that they're ever going to be rejoined to the Jewish people. At least the Shevet Ephraim, yes. Now, you may ask, well, why should they be in a better position? They were not following God's rules. But again, since they were making calculations based on the covenant to Abraham, so they were trying to obey God's rules, even though they misunderstood. So it seems that they will have a connection to the Jewish people. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. There are several opinions. Sure. But the Vilna Gaon says Yehuda ben Beseira himself took the position that it was the Shevet Ephraim, and he is from them, and therefore Lishi Tasso, he didn't have land, and if he didn't have land, he didn't go to Eretz Yisrael for the Korban Pesach. So it's in Perek Chelik, yeah, and the Gemara says it in the Kol Aliyah. Okay, alrighty. Yeah, so that's the idea of Misha Ein Lo Karka is Pater Min Hariyah. That's in the Gemara, and Taisus extends it to the Korban Pesach itself. Now, one more point about the really Baloscha, but just different Ha'aris about Levium and Kohanim and the like. The Mishnah in Chulin makes a very interesting observation. It makes the point that what makes a Kohen puzzle is not the same as what makes a Levi puzzle. What makes a Kohen puzzle is kosher by a Levi, and what makes a Levi puzzle is kosher by a Kohen. A Kohen gets puzzle if a Kohen has a mum. If a Kohen, just like you don't bring a korban with a blemish, if a Kohen has a blemish, he is not allowed to do the Avodah. Even if it's temporary, as long as it's there. A broken leg, a Kohen cannot do the Avodah, whatever it would be. A Levi that has a mum can still do his job. On the other hand, what puzzles a Levi? So the Torah actually gives a mandatory retirement age for Leviim that's pretty young. A Levi enters his service at the age of 30 and retires from service at the age of 50. Now, that may sound real old to you, but, as I say, I don't feel it's that old. Okay, used to. Okay. Now, there is a stira. Rashi points out, one pasuk says a Levi starts at 30, another pasuk says a Levi starts at 25. So Rashi says there was a 5-year apprenticeship, whatever that meant exactly. And from here we learn out that if you've been trying to do something for 5 years and you were not successful, it's time to move on to something else, because a Levi is given 5 years of apprenticeship and then gets promoted. Presumably, if he wouldn't be competent after the 5 years, that shows that's not for him. So just as a little aside, countless yeshiva students, they always like to quote this Rashi to their Rosh Yeshivas, to their Rebbes, and they say, I've been in yeshiva 5 years, not successful, time to go on. So if the Rosh Yeshiva tries to convince you to stay, they have two different approaches. There's the warm and fuzzy approach, and then there's the tough love approach. The warm and fuzzy says, what do you mean not successful? Not successful. When you came, could you read a Rashi by yourself? And now you can read a Rashi. Success. Yeah, okay, you didn't do as much as you thought you can do. But to say there's no success, chas v'shalom. Of course there's success. Right? That's the warm and fuzzy guy. That you don't tell me you didn't succeed, you succeeded. The other approach is, don't tell me you tried, you didn't try. Meaning the test is, you tried for 5 years and you didn't succeed. So if I want to refute your statement, there are two ways I can do it. I could focus on, you didn't try, or I can focus on, you succeeded. So that depends on kind of the personality of the Rebbe, whatever it would be. But usually, one or both will often be true. Either you didn't try enough, or you should also recognize that you did succeed. And by the way, I'm not poo-pooing that. I mean, that's a real emes, that we have to be makir. That even if we didn't achieve everything we should have achieved, we could have achieved, we have to give ourselves credit for our successes. It's an important idea in Avodas Hashem, that the same way you have to be aware of the mistakes and the deficits and the shortcomings, you also have to be aware of your successes. You know, it's like an accounting. Cheshbon HaNefesh is spiritual accounting. Right? Cheshbon HaNefesh. Now, for some reason, when we think about Cheshbon HaNefesh, we think, oh, that means I got to make a list of everything I did wrong. Well, wait a second. What type of accountant only records liabilities and not assets? Right? If I'm preparing a financial statement, Cheshbon, which quite literally means accounting, and I only put down the deficits, that's a very inaccurate picture. An accountant has to put down the debits and the credits, the liabilities and the assets. So in Cheshbon HaNefesh, it's important not only to be cognizant of my mistakes, which yes, that should be part of it, but you also have to be cognizant of your successes. And so the idea that for me to simply say, I've been here 5 years and I'm not successful, not totally true. There's a lot of success that a person can have. Maybe they're in modest ways, but to acknowledge it. So be it as it may, that's the 25 versus the 30. Okay. But the interesting point is, Levium do have a mandatory retirement age of 50. Kohanim do not. Kohanim can work 70, 80, 90. They can keep on going. So the Mishnah does not explain the reason for this, but it is a correlation. Kohanim get puzzle with mum, and they don't get puzzle with years. Levium get puzzle with years, and they don't get puzzle with mum. Yeah, very interesting. So the question is, how do you make sense of that? Like, why should years be so important for Levi, and why should mum be so important for Kohen? Right? Interesting question. So they say, b'shem, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad. But again, the reason I say it b'shem is because I have not been able to find it, and a number of Chabad people also are not aware of this, so I don't want to say it mamash, that it is from the Tzemach Tzedek. But someone had once told me this many, many years ago, and they said it from the Tzemach Tzedek. But be it as it may, even if I cannot trace the exact source, it's a very beautiful machshava. And the machshava is that Kohen and Levi represent two different ways of serving Hashem. The Kohen represents serving Hashem by the book, follows the rules constantly, consistently, over and over again. If you study the laws of Karbanos, you will see there is no room for improvisation, no room for creativity, no room for, I'd like to do it a little different today. Even a relatively minor thing. Let's say a Kohen would like to put on a special necktie or a special scarf in honor of the Avodah. Do you know that's going to make the whole Avodah puzzle? Because a Kohen is only allowed to wear the big day kahuna if he wears an extra garment. The service is puzzle. So we could define the Kohen as the person whose Avodah is stable, consistent, does not fluctuate by moods, is not affected by emotional state. He does the same thing over and over and over again, and he follows the rules exactly. Let's call that the halachic Jew, the Jew that says, I do the halacha, I don't deviate. The Levi is a different type of religious personality. The Levi is in the realm of song, of music, of ecstasy. By definition, that involves creativity, that involves tapping into emotion. The music would be their own compositions, actually. And even the shir, it's true that in later times, the shir was standardized by certain chapters of Tehillim, but that's certainly not what the Torah requires. The Torah allows them, when the Torah says Leviim are supposed to sing during the Avodah, they could sing whatever they want. They could do their original compositions. Again, it tended not to develop that way, but that's what the Torah allows. So the world of Levi is not the world of rule and detail. It is the world of emotion and feeling and passion. Now, each type of Avodah has a Maila and a drawback. The Maila of the Kohen is that it's predictable and stable, because since he's not, when your spiritual life depends on your emotions go up and down and up and down, and there are days you're not going to be inspired, and there are days that you're not going to feel close to Hashem. So if you're governed by your emotion, there are times you're not going to serve God. The Kohen knows, no matter what, I got to do my job. So the Maila of the Kohen is stability, consistency, and regularity. Right? The Levi doesn't have that. The Levi is kind of unstable. When I'm inspired, I'm inspired. When I'm not inspired, I'm not inspired. The chisaron of the Kohen, though, is things can get routinized and soulless, without passion, without feeling. You're going through the motions. The Levi does not go through the motions. The Levi brings genuine emotional excitement to what they're doing. So the Maila of the Levi is emotional passion. The Maila of the Kohen is stability and consistency, which doesn't fluctuate. So based on this idea, you can see the following. A Kohen is not puzzled by age, because if your Avodah is consistency and stability, you only get better with age. The longer you do it, the more you have the routine down. So for what the Kohen does, age is only an improvement. But for what the Levi does, age can be burnout. Because when your service is emotional intensity, habituation through repetition can take it away. So in the world of passion and emotion, age is the enemy, habituation. But in the world of stability and consistency, age is your ally. Now, mum represents physical disability. So yeah, the thing that'll stop the Kohen is physical disability, meaning he will work until he's physically unable. So that's why mum is his blockage. But that's not a blockage for a Levi. Because when the emotions are strong enough, you can transcend even physical disabilities to a certain degree. Like the mother, right? I'm sure you've heard the story, a child gets trapped under a car, and the mother comes and lifts up the car. She may be in the hospital for 6 months afterwards, but in that moment her emotions are so strong that it gives her a power beyond what she thought was possible. Now, I'm not necessarily endorsing those Christian faith healers that they tell the guy in the wheelchair, get up! But in point of fact, there is a certain remarkable mind over matter that can sometimes do things like that. So that's why for a Levi, the sakana is the age, which is habituation and constant repetition that burns you out, but not physical disability. Because when the emotions are strong enough, they can overcome that. With the Kohen gets better with age, but physical disability will stop him. You know, I don't know if there was a certain type of person, there still is, but they're kind of dying out. But I remember myself, both growing up and when I was a rabbi in a shul, I knew such people, very, very beloved people. They were not yeshiva educated because they grew up in the United States before there were yeshivas. They're public school educated. But they were so committed to the routine of halacha that they would never miss a mincha or a ma'ariv. I mean, I knew a 90-year-old guy. When there was snow, when there was blizzards, he would just walk along, He was a block away. It would take him 45 minutes. It was unthinkable. I mean, I might not go. I might stay at home. It was unthinkable for this guy to miss a mincha and a ma'ariv. He was the Kohen. He went by the book. He wasn't dancing at a Karlbach minyan or something like that. But he went by the book. Well, he knew whatever he knew he was supposed to do, he just did. Like no questions asked. So it turns out, therefore, that the Kohen is the world of halacha and the Levi is the world of emotion. So the mussar that we have to take from this is that each and every one of us build our own Beis HaMikdash in our hearts. Bilvavi Mishkan Evnech. We build a Mishkan for Hashem. And in our Mishkan, we have to be both Kohanim and Leviim. The emotion of the Levi and the halachic daikanut, exactitude of the Kohen. You need both. We have to be the Kohen and the Levi at the same time. Okay, be well, take care.